Okay, let's just dive right into this. 98%. It's a massive number, right? When you ask people in the abstract, a staggering 98% of Americans will tell you that free speech is an absolutely crucial constitutional right. It sounds like this rock-solid, impenetrable consensus. But here is the paradox we're looking at today. It turns out this seemingly universal agreement, it's actually incredibly fragile the second it gets tested in the real world.
So welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating new study that was just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS. The researchers actually used a real-world, highly unprecedented political shift to measure exactly how elite messaging can alter our most foundational democratic norms. It's this brilliant, totally data-driven look at how what we say we believe can change almost overnight, just depending on who happens to be talking. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The free speech paradox. 2. Testing elite influence. 3. Divergent partisan reactions. And 4. The power of rhetoric. We are going to take a strictly neutral, data-backed journey through this whole experiment. Okay, starting off with Section 1, the free speech paradox. Let's look at this tension in our values. To really understand this, we have to look at the baseline rhetoric right before the study began. Back in early 2025, President Donald Trump was actively positioning himself as an ardent champion of speech rights. He famously stated, "I will bring back free speech to America." For the researchers, this was perfect because it established a very clear, measurable benchmark. You have political leaders vocally championing this core constitutional right to their base. But then, the environment completely shifted.
That brings us to Section 2, testing elite influence, and this sudden political shift.
Let's walk through exactly how this happened. We started with those broad pro-speech claims in early 2025. Then, in mid-2025, the political landscape was severely shaken by the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. And following that specific event, the administration abruptly reversed course. President Trump and his allies explicitly began calling for speech restrictions. They were specifically targeting negative media coverage and individuals who they felt somehow justify the attack. Now, for a sitting president in modern history, this was a largely unprecedented pivot. So here is the million-dollar question that the PNAS authors wanted to answer. What actually happens to public opinion when partisan elites suddenly attack a universally cherished democratic norm? Do everyday voters hold on to that 98% consensus we talked about? Or do their opinions just shift to follow their political leaders? To figure this out, they set up a really rigorous study. Let's quickly look at their methodology. In October 2025, they ran a pre-registered experiment with just over 1,300 U.S. adults. They made absolutely sure the demographics were quota-matched to the general population. And crucially, this is important, it was perfectly balanced between people who voted for Donald Trump and those who didn't. So we know the data we're about to look at is completely representative and scientifically sound. Here's how they set up the actual test. They randomly exposed participants to one of 3 different conditions. The first was anti-speech rhetoric, which used actual real-world quotes from the administration demanding restrictions. The second was pro-speech rhetoric. For this one, researchers used a really clever mirror technique. They generated text that sounded exactly like the anti-speech quotes, but completely flipped the meaning to defend speech. And the third was just a simple baseline control with no treatment. This setup guarantees a perfect test to see how specific rhetoric shapes opinions. Moving on to Section 3, partisan reactions. Let's dive into these diverging responses. Okay, check this out. When Trump voters were exposed to the actual anti-speech quotes, their support for government censorship spiked significantly. We're looking at a 0.35 increase in support for censoring out-party media and a 0.34 increase for censoring out-party individuals. Now, to put that abstract data into perspective, the researchers note this essentially means roughly 1 in 3 of these voters moved from a totally neutral stance to actively supporting censorship. That is a massive jump. But in stark contrast, non-Trump voters had the complete opposite reaction to those exact same anti-speech quotes. It created this huge backlash effect. Their support for censoring out-party media dropped by 0.25, and it dropped by 0.19 for censoring individuals. Basically, hearing the administration actively call for censorship made this group significantly more protective of out-party speech. So, what does this all mean? Ultimately, it shows that elite rhetoric pushes partisans in completely opposite directions on fundamental constitutional rights. It acts like a giant polarizing wedge. A single set of quotes literally split the public, shifting both sides entirely away from the center. further apart on an issue that, remember from the very beginning, they previously agreed on almost unanimously. All right, let's head into our final section, number 4, the power of rhetoric, source versus message. Now, this next finding is wild. When the researchers ran a variation where they attributed the quotes just to a generic prominent politician, the results across the board were identical. They found what scientists call a null interaction effect. Basically, naming the specific politician didn't matter at all. The rhetoric itself was powerful enough to trigger the exact same partisan shifts, whether the source was explicitly named or not. Why does that happen, you might be wondering? It's because of a concept political scientists call an implicit partisan signal. This is when the actual content, the specific style, or even just the general familiarity of the rhetoric triggers a partisan reaction all on its own. The respondents unconsciously recognized the tone of the messaging, so those generic quotes manipulated their opinions just as effectively as the explicitly named ones. The message itself was the trigger. Now, what you really need to take away from this is that this isn't just some abstract survey exercise. There are immediate, very serious, real-world consequences to this kind of rhetoric. The researchers are grounding this data in reality, warning that it normalizes illiberal attitudes practically overnight. And we actually saw this manifest in tangible ways following the events of 2025. Things like the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel in the media and everyday employees facing serious disciplinary action or even termination simply for their speech. The researchers' ultimate warning is pretty blunt. They say, quote, even temporary increases in support for censorship could undermine democratic norms in practice. See, the guardrails of a democracy aren't just written laws. They're the shared norms of the people. And when elites decide to normalize censorship, those shared unspoken norms start to buckle incredibly fast. So, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. If a 98% consensus on something as absolutely fundamental as free speech can fracture this quickly, just from a shift in elite messaging, how resilient is American democracy when elites actively challenge its core values? It's a huge question, and one the data suggests we should all be paying very close attention to. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this study, and I will see you on the next explainer.